Hello and welcome back, my lovely Lovecraftians, to The Horror in the Burying Ground by H.P. Lovecraft for Hazel Heald. When the stale highway to Rutland is closed, travelers are forced to take the still water road past Swamp Hollow. The scenery is superb in places, yet somehow the route has been unpopular for years now. There is something so depressing about it, especially near Stillwater itself. Motorists feel subtly uncomfortable about the tight shuttered farmhouses on the knoll just north of the village, and about the white-bearded half-wit who haunts the old burying ground on the south, apparently talking to the occupants of some of the graves. Not much is left of Stillwater now. The soil is played out and most of the people have drifted to the towns across the distant river, or to the city beyond the distant hills, of course. The steeples of the old white church had fallen down, and half the 20-odd straggling houses are empty in various stages of decay. Normal life is found only around Peck's General Store and filling station, and it is here that the curious stop now and then to ask about the shuttered houses and the idiot who mutters amongst the dead. Most of the questionnaires come away with a touch of distaste and disquiet. They find the shabby loungers oddly unpleasant and full of unnamed hints in speaking of the long past events brought up before their time. There is a menacing, portentous quality in the tones which they use to describe very ordinary events. A seemingly unjustified tendency to assume a fruitive, suggested, confidential air, and to fall into awesome whispers at certain points, which insidious disturbs the listeners. Old Yankees often talk like that, of course, but in this case, the melancholy aspect of the half-moldering village and the dismal nature of the story unfolded right before their eyes give these gloomy, secretive mannerisms an added significance. One feels profoundly the quintessential of horror that lurks beyond the isolated Puritan and his strange repressions. He feels it and longs to escape perceptibly into clearer air. The loungers whisper impressively that the shuttered house is of old distaste, and it did belong to old Miss Spragg, Sophie Spragg, whose brother Tom was buried on the 17th of June, back in '86. Sophie was never the same after that funeral. That and the other thing which happened that same day. And in the end, she took to staying in all the time. Won't even be seen now, but leaves notes under the back door mat and has her things brought from the store by Ned Peck's boy, afraid of something. The old Swamp Hollow burying ground most of all. Never could be dragged near there since her poor brother and the other one were laid away. Not much wonder, though, seeing the way crazy Johnny Dow and his rants. He hangs around the burying ground all day and sometimes at night and claims he talks with Tom and the other. And then he marches by Sophie's house and shouts things at her. That's why she began to keep the shutters closed. He says things are coming from somewhere to get her sometimes. ought to be stopped, but no one can be too hard on poor Johnny. Besides, Steve Barber always had his opinions. Johnny does his talking to two of the graves. One of them is Tom Sprague's, and the other, at the opposite end of the graveyard, is that of Henry Thorndyke, who was buried on the same day. Henry was the village's undertaker, the only one in miles, and never liked around Stillwater. A city fellow from Rutland, been to college and full of book learning, read queer things no one else ever heard of, and mixed chemicals for no good purpose, always trying to invent something new, fangled embalming fluid or some foolish kind of medicine. Some folks said he had tried to be a doctor, but failed in his studies and took to the next best profession. Of course, there wasn't much undertaking to do in a place like Stillwater, but Henry farmed on the side. Mean, morbid disposition, and a secret drinker, if you could judge by the empty bottles in his rubbish heap. No wonder Tom Sprague hated him and blackballed him from the Mosaic Lodge and warned him off when he tried to make up to Sophie. The way he experimented on animals was against nature and scripture. Who could forget the state that collie dog was found in, or what happened to old Miss Ackley's cat? Then there was the matter of Dakin Lavius' calf. When Tom came by, he had led a band of the village boys to demand accounting. The curious thing was that the calf came alive after all in the end, though Tom had found it as stiff as a poker. Some said the joke was on Tom, but Thorndyke probably thought otherwise, since he had gone down under his enemies first before the mistake was discovered. Tom, of course, was half drunk at the time. He was a vicious brute at best, and kept his poor sister half cowed with threats. That's probably why she is such a fear rat creature still. There were only two of them, and Tom would never let her leave, because that meant splitting the property. Most of the fellows were too afraid of him to shine up to Sophie. He stood 6'1" in his stockings, but Henry Thorndyke was a sly cuss who had always had ways of doing things behind folks' backs. He wasn't much to look at, but Sophie never discouraged him any. Mean and ugly as he was, she'd have been glad if anybody could have freed her from her brother. She may not have stopped to wonder how she could get clear of him after he got her clear of Tom. Well, that was the things and how they were that stood in June of '86. Up to this point, the whispers of the loungers at Peck's store are not so unbearably portentous, but as they continue, the element of secretness in Malang's tension grew. Tom Sprague, it appears, used to go to Rutland on periodic sprees, his absence being that Henry Thorndyke's great opportunities. He was always in bad shape when he got back, and old Dr. Pratt, deaf and half blind though he was, used to warn him about his heart and about the danger of delirium tremens. Folks could always tell by the shouting and cursing when he was home again. It was on the 9th of June, on a Wednesday, the day after young Joshua Goodenough finished building his newfangled silo, that Tom started out of his last and longest spree. He came back the next Tuesday morning, and folks at the store saw him lashing his bay stallion the way he did when whiskey had a hold of him. Then there came shouts and shrieks and oaths from the Sprague house, and the first thing anybody knew, Sophie was running over to old Dr. Pratt's at top speed. The doctor found Thorndyke at Sprague's when he got there, and Tom was on the bed in his room, with eyes staring and foam around his mouth. Old Pratt fumbled around and gave the usual test, then shook his head sullenly and told Sophie she had suffered a great bereavement, that her nearest and dearest had passed through the pearly gates to a better land. Just as everybody knew he would if he didn't let up on his drinking. Sophie kind of sniffled. The loungers whispered, but didn't seem to take on much. Thorndyke didn't do anything but smile. Perhaps at the ironic fact that he, always an enemy, was now the only person who could be of any use to Thomas Spragg. He shouted something in old Dr. Pratt's half-good ear about the need of having the funeral early on account of Tom's condition. Drunks like that were always doubtful subjects, and any extra delay with merely rural facilities would entail consequences, visual and otherwise, hardly acceptable to the deceased loving mourners. The doctor had muttered that Tom's alcohol career ought to have involved him pretty well in advance, but Thorndyke assured him to the contrary, at the same time boasting of his own skill and of the superior methods he had devised through his experiments. It is here that the whispers of the loungers grew acutely disturbing. Up to this point, the story is usually told by Ezra Davenport or Luther Fry if Urza is laid up with chilblains, as he is apt to be in winter. But from here and there on, old Calvin Wheeler takes up the thread, and his voice has a damningly insidious way of suggesting hidden horror. If Johnny Dow happened to be passing by, there is always a pause, for Stillwater does not like to have Johnny talk too much with strangers. Calvin edges close to the traveler and sometimes seizes a coat lapel with his gnarled, molten hand while he half shuts his watery blue eyes. "Well, sir," he whispered, "Henry, he went home and got an undertaker's fixin'. Crazy Johnny Dow lugged most of 'em in, for he was always doing chores for Henry and says, as Dr. Pratt isn't crazy. But Johnny should have lay out that body. Doc always did say as how he thought that Henry talked too much, boasting what a fine workman he was, and how lucky it was that Stillwater had a regular undertaker, instead of burying folks just as they were, like they do over in Whitby. Suppose, says he, some fellows was to be took with some of the paralyzing crimes like you read about, how the body like it when they lowered him down and began shoveling the dirt back. How'd he like it when he was choking down there, and the headstand scratching in the tavern if he had chanced to get back to the power, but all the time knowing it wasn't no use? No, sir, I tell you, it's a blessing Stillwater got a smart doctor, as he always knows when a man's dead and when he ain't, and a trained undertaker who can fix a corpse so he'll stay put without no troubles at all." That was the way Henry went on talking, most like he was talking to poor Tom's remains, and old Doc Pratt, he didn't like what he was able to catch of it, even though Henry did call him a smart doctor. Crazy Johnny kept watching over the corpse, and it didn't make it none too pleasant the way he'd slobber about things like, "He ain't cold, Doc," or "I see his eyelids moving," or "There's a hole in his arm just like the ones I get when Henry gives me a syringe full of what makes me feel good." Thorndyke shut him up on that, though we all knowed he'd been giving poor Johnny drugs. It's a wonder the poor fellow ever got clear of that habit. But the worst thing, according to the doctor, was the way the body jerked up when Henry began to shoot it full of embalming fluid. He'd been boasting about what a fine new formula he'd been practicing on cats and dogs, when all of a sudden Tom's corpse began to double up like it was alive and fixing to wrestle. Land of gossip, the doc says he was scared stiff, though he knew the way corpses act when the muscles began to stiffen. Well, sir, the long and short of it is that the corpse sat up and grabbed a hold of Thorndyke's syringe so that it got stuck in Henry himself, and given him as a neat dose of his own embalming fluid as you wish to see. That got Henry pretty scared, though he yanked the point out and managed to get the body down again and shot full of the fluid. He kept measuring more of the stuff out as though he wanted to be sure there was enough, and kept reassuring himself as not much had got into him. But Crazy John began singing out, "That's what you give Lynch Hopkins' dog when it got all dead and stiff, and then waked up again. Now you're going to get dead and stiff like Tom Sprogby. Remember, it don't set to work till after a long spell if you don't get much." Sophie was downstairs with some of the neighbors, my wife Matilde, and she was dead and gone. This 30 years was one of them. They were all trying to find out whether the Thorndyke was over when Tom came home, and whether finding him there was what set poor Tom off. I may as well say, as some folks thought it might be funny that Sophie didn't carry on more, nor mind the way Thorndyke had smiled. Not as anybody was hinting that Henry helped Tom off with some of his queer cooked-up fluids and syringes, or that Sophie would keep still if she thought so. But you know how folks will guess behind a body's back. We all know that the night crazy when Thorndyke had hated Tom, not without reason, at that. And Emily Barbaro says to my Matilde as how Henry was lucky to have old Doc Pright right on the spot with a death certificate, as didn't leave no doubt for nobody. When old Calvin gets to this point, he usually begins to mumble indistinguishably in his staggering old dirty white beard. Most listeners try to edge away from him, and he seldom appears to heed the gesture. It is generally Fred Peck, who was a very small boy at the time of the event, who continues the tale. Thomas Sprogg's funeral was held on Thursday, June 17, only 2 days after his death. Such haste was thought almost indecent in remote and inaccessible Stillwater, where long distance had to be covered by those who came. But Thorndyke had insisted that the peculiar condition of the body, well, it is deceased, and it does demand it. The undertaker had seemed rather nervous since preparing the body, and could be seen frequently feeling his pulse. Old Dr. Pratt thought he must be worrying about the accidental dose of embalming fluid. Naturally, the story of the laying out had spread so that a double zest animated the mourners who had assembled to glut their curiosities and morbid interest. Thorndyke, though, he was obviously upset. He seemed intent on doing his professional duties in magnificent style. Sophie and others who saw the body were most startled by its utter lifelessness, and the mortuary's verticero made doubtfully sure of his job of repeating certain injections at stated intervals. He almost wrung a sort of reluctant admiration from the town folks and visitors, though he tended to spoil that impression by his boastful and tasteless talk. Whenever he ministered to his silent charger, he would repeat the eternal ramblings about the good luck of having a first-class undertaker. What he would say, as if directly addressing the body, if Tom had one of those careless fellows who bury their subjects alive, the way he harped on the horrors of premature burial was truly barbarous and sickening. Services were held in the stuffy mess room, open for the first time since Miss Sprogg died. The tuneless little parlor organ groaned discontinually, and the coffin supported on the trestles near the hall door was covered with sickly-smelling flowers. It was obvious that a record-breaking crowd was assembling from far and near, and Sophie endeavored to look properly grief-stricken for their benefit. An unguardful moment, she seemed both puzzled and uneasy, dividing her scrutiny between the feverish-looking undertaker and the lifelike body of her brother. A slow disgust at Thorndyke seemed to be brewing within her. The neighbors whispered freely that she would soon send him about his business now that Tom was out of the way. That is, if she could, for such a slick customer was sometimes hard to deal with. But with her money and remaining looks, she might not be able to get another fellow, and he'd probably take care of Henry well enough. As the organ wheezed into beautiful aisles somewhere, the Methodist church choir added their lugubrious voices to the gruesome cacophony, and everyone looked piously at Deacon Levitt. Everyone, that is, except crazy Johnny Dow, who kept his eyes glued to the still form beneath the glass of the coffin. He was muttering softly to himself. Stephen Barber from the next farm was the only one who noticed Johnny. He shivered as he saw that the idiot was talking directly to the corpse, and even making foolish signs with his fingers as if to taunt the sleeper beneath the plate glass. Tom, he reflected, had kicked poor Johnny around on more than one occasion, though probably not without provocation. Something about the whole event was getting on Stephen's nerves. There was a suppressed tension and brooding abnormality in the air for which he could not account. Johnny ought not to have been allowed in the house, and it was curious what an effort the Thorndyke seemed to be making not to look at the body. Every now and then the undertaker would feel his pulse with an odd air. The Reverend Silas Atwood droned on in a plaintive monotone about the deceased, about the striking of death's sword in the midst of this little family, breaking the earthly tie between this loving brother and sister. Several of the neighbors looked furtively at one another from beneath lowered eyelids, while Sophie actually began to sob nervously. Thorndyke moved to her side and tried to reassure her, but she seemed to shrink curiously away from him. His motions were distinctively uneasy, as he seemed to feel acutely the abnormal tension permeating the air. Finally, conscious of his duty as master of ceremonies, he stepped forward and announced in a specular voice that the body might be viewed for the very last time. Slowly, the friends and neighbors filed past the briar, from which Thorndyke roughly dragged Crazy Johnny away. Tom seemed to be resting peacefully. That devil had been handsome in his day. A few genuine sobs and many feigned ones were heard, though most of the crowd were content to share curiously and whisper afterwards. Steve Barber lingered long and attentively over the still face and moved away shaking his head. His wife Emily, following after him, whispered that Henry Thorndyke had better not boast so much about his work, for Tom's eyes had come open. They had been shut when the service began, for she had been up and looked, but they certainly looked natural, not the way one would expect after nearly 2 whole days. When Fred Peck gets this far, he usually pauses, as if he did not like to continue. The listener, too, tends to feel that something unpleasant is ahead, but Peck reassures his audience with the statement that what happened isn't as bad as folks like to hint. Even Steve never put into words what he may have thought, and Crazy Johnny, of course, can't be counted at all. It was Lula Morse, the nervous old maid who sang in the choir, who seemed to have touched things off. She was filling past the coffin like the rest, but stopped to peer a little closer than anyone else expected the Barbers had peered. And then, without warning, she gave a shrill scream and fell in a dead faint. Naturally, the room was at once a chaos of confusion. Old Dr. Prout elbowed his way to Lula and called for some water to be thrown in her face, and others surged up to look at her and at the coffin. Johnny Dow began chanting to himself, "He knows, he knows, he knows. He can hear all what we're saying and see all what we are doing, and they'll bury him that way." But not one stopped to decipher his murmurs except Steve Barbaro. And a very few moments later, Luella began to come out of her faint, and could not tell exactly what had startled her. All she could whisper was, "The way he looked the way he looked. But to other eyes, the body seemed exactly the same. It was a gruesome sight, though, with the open eyes and all, and that high collaring. And then the bewildered crowd noticed something which put both Luella and the body out of their minds for just a moment. It was Thorndyke, on whom the sudden excitement and jolts of the crowd seemed to be having a curiously bad effort. He had evidently been knocked down in the general bustle and was on the floor trying to drag himself to a sitting posture. The expression on his face was terrifying and in the extreme, and his eyes were beginning to take on a glazed, fishy expression. He could scarcely speak aloud, but the husky rattle of his throat held an ineffable desperation which was obvious to all. "Get me home, quick, and let me be. That fluid I got in my arm by mistake. A heart action, this damned excitement. Too much. Wait, don't think I'm dead if I seem to, only the fluid, just get me home and wait. I'll come to later. Don't know how long. All the time I'll be conscious and know what's going on. Don't be deceived." And as his words trailed off into nothingness, old Dr. Pratt reached him and felt his pulse, watching a long time and finally shaking his head. "No use doing anything. He's gone. Heart's no good, and that fluid he got in his arm must have been bad stuff. I don't know what it is." A kind of numbness seemed to fall on all the company. New death and the chamber of death. Only Steve Barbaro thought to bring up Thorndyke's last choking words. Was he surely dead when he himself had said he might falsely seem so? Wouldn't it be better to wait a while and see what would happen? And for that matter, what harm would it do if Doc Pratt were to give Tom Sprague another looking over before the burial? Crazy Johnny was moaning and had flung himself on Thorndyke's body like a faithful dog. "Don't you bury him. Don't you bury him. He ain't dead no more, like Thompson dog, nor Deacon Levitt's calf was when he shot him full. He's got some stuff he puts into you that makes you seem like dead when you ain't. You seem like dead, but you know everything's what's going on, and the next day you come to as good as ever. Don't you bury him. He'll come to under the earth, and he can scratch up. He's a good man, and not like Tom Sprague. Hope to God Tom scratches and chokes for hours and hours and hours." But no one, save Barbaro, was paying any attention to poor Johnny. Indeed, what Steve himself had said had evidently fallen on deaf ears. Uncertainty was everywhere. Old Doc Pratt was applying his final test and mumbling about a death certificate blanks. And uncouth Elder Atwood was suggesting that something be done about a double interment. With Thorndyke dead, there was no undertaker this side of Rutland, and it would mean a terrible expense if one were to be brought from there. And if Thorndyke were not involved in this hot June weather, well, one couldn't tell, and there were no relatives or friends to be critical unless Sophie chose to be. But Sophie was on the other side of the room, staring silently, fixedly, and almost morbidly into her brother's coffin. Deacon Levitt tried to restore a semblance of decorum, and he had poor Thorndyke carried across the hall to the sitting room, meanwhile sending Zanus Wells and Walter Perkins over to the undertaker's house for a coffin on the right size. The key was in Henry's trouser pocket. Johnny continued to whine and paw at the body, and Elder Atwood amused himself with inquiring about Thorndyke's denomination, for Henry had not attended local services. When it was decided that his folks in Rutland were, all dead now, and they had all been Baptists, the Reverend Silence decided that the Deacon Levitt had better offer a brief prayer. It was a gala day for the funeral franchisers of Stillwater and vicinity. Even Luella had recovered enough to stay. Gossip murmured and whispered, buzzed busily. Why, a few composing touches were given to Thorndyke's cooling, stiffening form. Johnny had been cuffed out of the house, as most agreed he would have been there in the first place, but his distant howls were now and then weaved gruesomely in. When the body was encoffined and laid out beside the Thomas Sprague, the silent, almost frightening look Sophie gazed intently as she was gazed at her brother. She had not uttered a word for a dangerously long time, and the mixed expressions on her face was past all describing or interpreting. As the others withdrew to leave her alone with the dead, she managed to find a sort of mechanical speech, but no one could make out the words, and she seemed to be talking first to one body and then the other. And now, with what would seem to be an outsider, the acme of gruesome and consciously comedy, the whole funeral's murmury of the afternoon was listlessly repeated. Again, the organ wheezed, again, the choir screeched and scraped, again, a droning incantation arose, and again, the morbidly curious specters filed past a mock-bay object, this time a dull array of mortuary response. Some of the more sensitive people shivered at the whole proceeding, and again Stephen Barber felt an underlying note of eldritch horror and demonic abnormality. God, how lifelike both of the corpses were, and how in earnest poor Thorndyke had been about not wanting to be judged dead, and how he hated Tom Sprague. But what could one do in the face of common sense? A dead man was a dead man, and there was old Doc Pratt with his years of experience. If nobody else bothered, why should one bother oneself? Whatever Tom had got, he had probably deserved, and if Henry had done anything to him, well, the score was even now. Well, Sophie was free at last. As the peering procession moved at last towards the hall and the outer door, Sophie was alone with the dead once more. Elder Atwood was out in the road talking to the hearse driver from Lee's lively stable, and Deacon Levia was arranging for a double quota of pallbearers. Luckily, the hearses would hold 2 coffins. No hurry. Ed Plummer and Ethan Stone were going ahead with the shovels to dig the second grave. There would be 3 lively hacks and any number of private rigs in the cavalcade. No use trying to keep the crowd away from the graves. Then came that frantic scream from the parlor where Sophie and the bodies were. Its suddenness almost paralyzed the crowd and brought back the same sensation which had surged up when Luella had screamed and fainted. Steve Barbaro and Deacon Lambert started to go in, but before they could enter the house, Sophie was busting forth and sobbing and gasping. That face at the window, that face at the window, that face over there at the window. At the same time, a wild-eyed figure rounded the corner of the house, removing all mystery from Sophie's dramatic cry. It was very obviously the face's owner, poor crazy Johnny, who began to leap up and down, pointing at Sophie, shrieking, she knows, I seen it in her face when she looked at him and talked to him. She knows, and she ain't letting him go down on the earth to scratch and claw for air. But they'll talk to her so she can hear him. She'll talk to her and appear to her, and someday they'll come back and get her. Zanus Wells dragged the shrieking halfway to a woodshed behind the house and bolted him in as best as he could. His screams and poundings could be heard at a distance, but nobody paid him any further attention. The procession was made up, and with Sophie in the first hack, it slowly covered the short distance past the village to the Swamp Hollow burying ground. Elder Atwood made appropriate remarks as Thomas Sprague was laid to rest, and by the time he was through, Ed and Ethan had finished Thorndyke's grave on the other side of the cemetery, to which the crowd presently shifted. Deacon Levitt then spoke ornamentally, and the lowering process was repeated. People had begun to drift off in knots, and the clatter of receding buggies and carrying awls was quite universal. When the shovels began to fly again, as the earth thudded down on the coffin lids, Thorndyke's first, Steve Barber noticed the queer expression flitting over Sophie Sprague's face. He couldn't keep track of them all, but behind the rest there seemed to lurk a sort of wry perseverance, a half-suppressed look of vague triumph. He shook his head. Zanus had run back and let Crazy Johnny out of the woodshed before Sophie got home, and the poor fellow at once made frantically for the graveyard. He arrived before the shovelmen were through, and whilst many of the curious mourners were still lingering about, what he shouted into Tom Sprague's partly filled grave, and how he clawed at the loose earth of Thorndyke's freshly finished mound across the cemetery, surviving spectators still shudder to recall. Jonathan Blake, the constable, had to take him back to the town farm by force, and his screams waked dreadful echoes. This is where Fred Peck usually leaves off the story. What more he asks is there to tell. It was a gloomy tragedy, and one scarcely wonders that Sophie grew queer after that. This is all one hears in the hours is so late that old Calvin Wheeler had tottered home. But when he is still around, he breaks in again, in that damnably suggestive and insidious whisper sometimes those who hear him dread to pass, either the shuttered house or the graveyard afterwards, especially after dark. Fred was only a little shaver then, and don't remember no more than half of what was going on. You want to know why Sophie keeps her house shuttered, and why Crazy Johnny still keeps a talking to the dead and a shouting at Sophie's windows? Well, sir, I don't know. I know all there is to know, but I hear what I hear. Here, the old man ejects his cud of tobacco and leans forward to butthole the listener. It was that same night, mind ye, towards morning, and just 8 hours after the burials, when we heard the first scream from Sophie's house. Woke us all up, Steve and Emily Barber and me, and Matilda goes over hot-footed, all in night gear, and finds Sophie all dressed and dead fainted on the setting room floor. Luckily, she hadn't locked the door. When we get all up near her, she's shaking like a leaf, and wouldn't let on by so much of a word what was ailing her. Matilda and Emily done what they could to quiet her down, but Steve whispered things to me as they didn't make me none too easy. Come about an hour later, when we were allowed we'd be going home soon, that Sophie, she began to tip her head on one side like she was listening to something. Then, on the sudden, she screamed again and kneeled over in another faint. Well, sir, I'm telling what I'm telling, and I won't do no guessing like Steve Barber would have done if he dared. He always was the greatest hand for hidden things. Died 10 years ago to pneumonia. What we heard so faint like was just poor Crazy Johnny, of course. 'Tain't more than a mile to the burying ground, and he must have got out of the window where they locked him up in the town farm. Even if Constable Blake says he didn't get out that night, from that day to the day he hangs around them graves a-talking to the both of them, cussing and kicking at Tom's mound and putting posies and things on head wreaths. And when he ain't done nothing, that he's hanging around Sophie's shutter windows howling about what's a-coming soon to get her. She wouldn't never gone near the burying ground, and now she won't come out of the house at all, nor see nobody. Gotta say, there was a curse on Stillwater, and I'm dinged if she ain't half right, the way things is a-going to a pieces these days. There certainly was something queer about Sophie right along. Once when Sally Hopkins was a-calling on her in 97, or was it in 98? I think it was. There was an awful rattling at her windows, and Johnny was safe locked up at the time. At least so Constable Dodge swore up and down. But I ain't taking no stock in their stories about noises every 17th of June, or about faint shining figures a-trying Sophie's door, and winders every black morning about 2 o'clock. You see, It was about 2 o'clock in the morning that Sophie heard the sound and yelled over twice, that first night after the burying. Steve and me and Matilda and Emily heard the second lot, faint as it was, just like I told you, and I'm telling you again, as how it must have been. Johnny, over to the burying ground, let Jonathan Blake claim that what he will. There ain't no telling the sound of a man's voice so far off, and with our heads full of nonsense, it ain't no wonder why we thought that it was 2 voices, and voices that had not to be speaking at all. Stevie claimed to have heard more than I did. I verily believe he took some stock in ghosts. Matilda and Emily were so scared they didn't remember what they heard. And curious enough, nobody else in town, if anybody was awake at this ungodly hour, never said nothing about hearing no sounds at all. Whatever it was so faint, it might have been the winds if they hadn't been words. I made out a few, but don't want to say as I'd back up all Steve claims to have caught. She-devil, all the time, Henry, and alive was playing, so you know, said you'd stand by, get rid of him, and bury me, and a kind of change voice, and then there was that awful coming again someday, and a death-like squawk. But you can't tell me Johnny couldn't have made those sounds. Hey you, what's taking you off in such a hurry? Maybe there's more I could tell you. I had a mind. Such concludes The Horror in the Burying Ground by H.P. Lovecraft for Hazel Headland. I personally was a big fan of this one. I love when there's a rivalry in a story. And I love how the 2 characters had opposite views, and it was still centered around Sophie being as she would most likely be the reason that both characters are dead. On one side we had an alcoholic brother, and on the other side we had a failed doctor. This reminds me of one of the other stories by Robert E. Howard. If you can guess which one I'm talking about, comment below. It's similar to the fact that death in itself is a terrifying process, more morbid and meticulous than most would like to let on. My favorite part of the story probably was the fact that, though boasting of their success and their plans and their ploy, that even in the final moments, revenge is just as swift and sweet. That this failure of a doctor failed to even complete his mortuary to his worst enemy. His mortuary duties were also very horrid and twisted. The way that it has been said, or at least hinted on to said, that the mortuary would experiment on cats, dogs, and even possibly a cat, which I full-heartedly believe he well did. The townsfolk also have very interesting and very realistic ways of talking. I love their accents and how it's articulated. Overall, the horror in the burying ground is very, very well done. And it makes me wonder, there's 2 different outcomes in my mind at least. One outcome being that the bodies are still alive and they will claw them way out, which seems less likely. Or the second outcome is in a sick, twisted mind sphere that these eldritch horrors of ghosts or other entities do exist, and that they blame Sophie for their demise. How unlikely it is, though, for 2 very, very heated rivalries to team up together to torture Sophie, who had tortured them in a way, and had so much against them for what they've done to her. One being an alcoholic and the other not being a very good marriage candidate. I mean, it is very well known that the first way that most women would become serial killers back in the day was through poisonings, since it was less likely to be detected by doctors. Granted, our doctor here couldn't do much about embalming fluid being entered through the body. I do think that the embalming fluid is definitely of eldritch proportion, for sure, as our other end on the mortuary was very, very, very assisted into the way of saying, I'm not dead, just take me to my house. But, as the town folks said, a dead body is a dead body. Even if it doesn't go cold, so is cash, Cold hard cash is the same. They had to do what they had to do to preserve their little town. And with that, they both ended up in the ground. Overall, I really like the overarching story building, as most of H.P. Lovecraft stories do. I like how the town has old shabbled buildings, how the doctor is deaf in one ear and not even in good health himself. The mortician is just a failed doctor who couldn't do his own schooling and just did the next best thing. And the narcissism parallels very well with the alcoholism of the antagonist. Thoroughly, the story is very well crafted, and I wouldn't even mind reading it again, for there was a lot of characters and a lot going on. The story seems to be told from many perspectives, and I can really appreciate that, as we get to see the terrified screams of Luelle, and the terrified screams of Sophie, and the other opinions of the townsfolk. Overall, it really adds to the whole town being underneath this impression that there is an eldritch horror beyond comprehension right underneath their feet. Not only that, for a lot of people, death can be uncanny and horrifying. So the fact that there was 2 deaths in the same 2 days is a bit too much, if I do say myself. I don't know how they could have got everything together so quickly with it being proper. So even if there was an embalming fluid, I still think that this would have been improperly handled, in my honest opinion. Interestingly enough, I've learned recently that there's a lot of different things that go on with embalming and such, and that I would highly recommend the Mortuary's Assistant, which is what I almost let slip earlier. I was thinking of that game the whole time, that it's this multi-step process, and how much different it would be from modern medicine to the medicine of, it seems, 86. Be that, is this 1886 most likely, or is this 1986? Given H.P. Lovecraft's untimely death being in the mid-90s and the story taking place in 86, I'd assume that this was 1886, which would explain why the mortician wanted to make another great leap with medical being a thing. That was a time where many men and women wanted to make inventions or craft something new. And some of them would do it under pen names for different reasons, and some of them would end up doing things that we would find to be horrid, and even on the eldritch proportions to this day. But I digress. Leave your comments and theories below. With that said though, I also wanted to add something new. Since this story is so unique and we're reading longer ones, I'm going to do a summary and deeper meaning now after I did my reflection. H.P. Lovecraft's The Horror in the Burial Ground is written for Hazelhead. It begins not with a monster, but an ancient god, or some impossible cosmic discovery, but with a dying rural town. Stillwater is a nearly abandoned New England village surrounded by decaying houses, exhausted farmland, and an atmosphere that makes travelers uncomfortable to say the least, without immediately explaining why. 2 locations especially disturb outsiders. The first is the tightly shuttered farmhouse belonging to an elderly woman, Sophie Spragg. The second is the old Swamp Hollow burying grounds with a mentally deranged man named Johnny Dow, who spends his days speaking to the 2 graves. When travelers stop at the local general store and ask questions, the villagers tell them the story. Years earlier, Sophie lived with her brother, Tom Spragg. Tom was violent, controlling, and a frequent drunkard, and determined to prevent Sophie from leaving him because her departure would require dividing their shared property. Sophie therefore lived under his authority, frightened and trapped. The village undertaker Henry Thorndike had developed an interest in Sophie. Tom despised Henry and prevented the relationship from progressing. Henry was already disliked in Stillwater. He was educated, secretive, unpleasant, and fascinated by strange chemical compounds and experiments. He attempted to create new medicines and embalming fluids, sometimes testing them on the local animals. Several animals exposed to Henry's chemicals appeared completely dead and stiff, only to recover later. This detail will become the foundation of our entire story. One day, after a long drinking spree, Tom returns home and apparently dies. The elderly village doctor examines him and declares that his heart had failed him. Henry is present and quickly takes responsibility for preparing the body. During the embalming process, however, Johnny Dow notices several troubling signs. Tom is not cold. His eyelids appear to move. There's also a small mark on his arm, resembling the marks Johnny received when Henry injects him with drugs. Then, as Henry begins injecting the body with embalming fluid, Tom suddenly jerks upright in the confusion. Henry's syringe is driven into Henry's own arms, accidentally giving him an experimental dose of the fluid. Henry dismisses the danger, but Johnny remembers what happened to the animals. He warns Henry that the chemical may make him appear dead, while leaving him fully conscious. The effect might not begin immediately because Henry received only a small dose, but Johnny believes it will eventually paralyze him. Tom's funeral is arranged with suspicious speed. His body appears unusually lifelike. His skin retains color, and during the service his eyes open. Johnny watches the coffin ever so closely and quietly insists that Tom can hear everything happening to him. The implication is horrifying. Tom may never have been dead. He might have been chemically paralyzed by Henry, embalming while conscious, placed inside a coffin, prepared for burial while unable to see, hear, or feel. Kinda like locked-in syndrome. The funeral becomes even stranger when Henry suddenly collapses, before losing his ability to move or speak. He desperately warns the village not to mistake him for being dead. He explains that the fluid was only to make him appear lifeless. He says that he remains conscious and will eventually recover. Unfortunately for him, though, the village doctor declares him dead anyways. Johnny begs everyone not to bury Henry. He explains exactly what the chemical does, but because the village considers him an idiot, they ignore the only person who fully understands the situation. Instead of waiting for Henry to recover, the town places him in a coffin beside Tom. The funeral ceremony is repeated, this time for both men. Sophie watches the bodies with a complicated expression. At different moments she appears frightened, disgusted, thoughtful, and almost triumphant. She has finally been freed from her abusive brother, and she also seems to understand more about the two supposed deaths than she would like to admit. Johnny appears outside the window and accuses her directly. He says that Sophie knows both men are alive. He claims she is deliberately allowing them to be buried, knowing they will awaken underground and suffocate while scratching at the lids of their coffins. The village dismisses Johnny again. Tom and Henry are carried at opposite ends of the burying ground and placed beneath the earth. As dirt strikes the coffin, Sophie displays what one witness described as a half-suppressed expression of utter triumph. 8 hours later, Sophie hears voices. Maybe it's resting too heavily on her what her sins have been done. The witness claimed the sound may have come from Johnny speaking near the cemetery, although authorities insist he remained locked inside the town farm that night. The voices appear to belong to two different men. Fragments can be heard through the darkness, words such as alive, Henry, bury me, get rid of them, and you said you'd stand by, drift towards Sophie's house. One voice calls her a devil, another promises to return. From that night forward, Sophie hides inside her shuttered home. Johnny continues visiting both graves. He curses Tom, who abused him, but places flowers on Henry's grave, for he did care for him in a twisted way. Maybe he was just an experimental guinea pig, or maybe he was a dear friend, both in isolation. He also stands outside Sophie's house, shouting that the dead will eventually return for her. That is the basis of the story, but this is a tale of how deeper horror comes from, and how it's never stated directly, but lets the mind wander into madness itself. The first major theme is fear of being alive. Another inline theme to me is locked-in syndrome, one of the most terrifying medical phenomenons known to date, in my opinion. Premature burial was already a powerful 19th and early 20th century fear. Medical knowledge was improving, but ordinary people still worried that paralysis, coma, or disease would cause someone to be declared dead too early. H.P. Lovecraft turns that fear into something even worse because Tom and Henry may not merely be unconscious, they may remain completely aware. They could potentially hear the funerals, they could feel themselves being handled, they know they are inside coffins, they hear the dirt falling above them, and they can do nothing. And once the chemical wears off, they may regain movement only after escape has become impossible. The story repeatedly describes coffins, stiff body, embalming fluid, open eyes, death certificate, and the sound of earth striking. These details force the reader to imagine death not as a peaceful absence of consciousness, but as imprisonment inside of one's own body, one's own inner workings. It really builds into that you need to reflect on what's happening to two completely different people, that death comes for us all. The second major theme, in my opinion, is the danger of refusing to listen to an outsider. Johnny is treated as the village idiot. He speaks in an unpolished way, behaves strangely, and has been exploited through Henry's drug injections. Because of this, the village assumes that nothing he says deserves any serious attention. But Johnny is consistently the most perceptive person in the story. He notices that Tom is still warm. He sees Tom's eyelids move. He recognizes the injection mark. He has one of his own. He remembers what the chemicals did to the animal. He correctly predicts what will happen to Henry. He understands Sophie's expressions. Every warning he gives is dismissed, even while the evidence supports him. The respectable people, the doctor, the minister, the undertaker, the constable, the church members, the whole town fail almost completely. Johnny, whom everyone considers irrational, is the only character willing to acknowledge the truth. This reversal makes the villagers partly responsible for the horror that happened that day. They do not knowingly murder the two men, but their pride, conformity, and unwillingness to question authority allows the burials to happen. The third theme is hidden guilt. Sophie is unquestionably a victim of Tom's abuse. He controls her life, frightens her, prevents her from leaving, and her desire to escape him is understandable. But the ending suggests that Sophie and Henry may have planned Tom's apparent death together. Henry may have injected Tom with the chemical before the doctor arrived, intending only to make him appear dead. Sophie may have agreed to remain silent as Tom could be buried alive. The mysterious voices suggest that Henry expected Sophie to protect him, or wait for him to recover. Instead, when Henry was accidentally paralyzed by his own drug, Sophie allowed him to be buried as well. Her decision may therefore be both revenge and self-preservation. Tom represents brutal physical control. Henry initially appears to offer Sophie freedom, but he is also manipulative, cruel, and dangerous. Once Tom is removed, Sophie may realize that Henry could become another man controlling her life, and she doesn't want to take that risk. By remaining silent, she escapes them both and keeps the full property to herself. This does not necessarily make Sophie an uncomplicated villain. Her actions emerge from years of fear, confinement, and abuse. However, the story refuses to make her entirely innocent. The strange look of triumph on her face suggests that she understands exactly what is happening beneath the earth, and we don't know what goes on behind other people's doors. I know that the brother was abusive, but what was Sophie doing as well? What was her life like beyond this? Her late terror is therefore not simply a fear of ghosts. It's the return of guilt, that gnawing feeling that you did something you can never come back from. The voices outside her home may be supernatural spirits, distant cries from the cemetery, eldritch horrors beyond mortal comprehension, or Johnny imitating the dead, or manifestations of Sophie's own consciousness, but we'll never get the answer. The uncertainty is essential to the story. If the voices are ghosts, and Tom and Henry have returned to punish her, does she deserve it? If the voices are the men themselves, then they regain consciousness underground, scream across the field while slowly suffocating. There's no good outcome to this. If the voices are only Johnny and Sophie, it's still terrifying because his accusations are true. And if there are no voices at all, Sophie's mind has created them because she cannot live peacefully with what she allowed to happen. Every possibility condemns her. The story also examines the decay of an entire community. Stillwater is physically collapsing, but the town's moral structure has already collapsed as well. Its people gossip about abuse without intervening. They attend funerals partly for entertainment. They care about appearance, expense, ceremony, and social respectability more than they care about whether two people are actually dead. The village buries the truth in the same way it buries Tom and Henry. That may be the deepest meaning of the story. The horror is not simply that the dead men might return. The horror is the whole community can witness warning after warning after warning and sense that something is terribly wrong and still continue with the ceremony because stopping would be inconvenient. Tom is buried beneath the earth. Henry is buried across from him. Sophie buries her involvement behind locked doors and closed shutters. The villagers bury their suspicions beneath gossip, superstition, and denial. Only Johnny refuses to let the truth remain silent. He continues speaking to the graves because it's a symbolic sense. The graves are still speaking to everyone. They contain the consequences of cruelty, revenge, pride, and a collection of indifference. Ultimately, the horror in the burial ground is a story about what happens when people mistake stillness for death, authority for knowledge, silence for innocence, and burial for an ending. The bodies may be underground, but the truth refuses to stay there.